The conference room buzzed with the usual pre-meeting energy as senior military officials filed in, their polished boots clicking against the marble floor of the Pentagon's most secure briefing chamber. The morning sun streamed through bulletproof windows, casting long shadows across the mahogany table that had witnessed countless decisions shaping global security. Colonel Marcus Thompson adjusted his tie and scanned the room, mentally cataloging the assembled brass. Defense Secretary Williams sat at the head of the table, his weathered face bearing the weight of recent intelligence reports from the Middle East. To his right, Admiral Richardson shuffled through classified documents, his silver hair catching the light as he prepared for what promised to be another grueling strategy session. But Marcus's attention was drawn to a woman sitting quietly in the corner, observing rather than participating in the pre-meeting conversations. She appeared to be in her late 40s, with graying brown hair pulled back in a simple bun and wearing a modest business suit that seemed almost out of place among the sea of dress uniforms. Her posture was relaxed yet alert, and there was something in her steady gaze that suggested she was absorbing every detail of the room's dynamics. "Who's the civilian?" Marcus whispered to Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Chen, who had just taken the seat beside him. Sarah glanced toward the corner and shrugged. "New Pentagon advisor, I think. Something to do with strategic planning. Been sitting in on meetings for the past week but hasn't said much." The woman in question seemed completely comfortable with her role as observer. She had introduced herself simply as Dr. Elizabeth Morgan when she first appeared in these high-level briefings, offering no elaboration on her background or credentials. Her presence had been explained only as special consultation on current operations, which in Pentagon speak could mean anything from academic expertise to intelligence analysis. What struck Marcus most was how she seemed to blend into the background despite being one of the few women in a room dominated by career military men. She took notes sparingly, asked no questions, and, when addressed directly, responded with precise, measured answers that revealed deep knowledge without offering opinions. It was as if she possessed some invisible quality that made others comfortable ignoring her while simultaneously commanding a subtle respect. Defense Secretary Williams called the meeting to order, and the familiar ritual of status reports began. The situation in Eastern Europe demanded immediate attention, with Russian forces massing near the Ukrainian border in what intelligence suggested might be preparation for a larger offensive. Satellite imagery revealed concerning troop movements, and Allied communications intercepted over the past 72 hours indicated a potential escalation that could draw NATO forces into direct conflict. "Gentlemen," Williams began, his voice carrying the weight of decades in military and political service, "we're looking at a situation that could spiral beyond our current containment strategies. The President wants options, and he wants them yesterday." Admiral Richardson leaned forward, his fingers steepled as he addressed the room. "Naval assets in the Black Sea are positioned for rapid response, but intelligence suggests the Russians are testing our commitment levels. They're pushing boundaries to see how far we'll let them go before responding with force." The discussion that followed revealed the complexity of modern warfare, where traditional military might have to be balanced against cyber threats, economic warfare, and the ever-present specter of nuclear escalation. Each officer contributed expertise from their respective branches, painting a picture of a world balanced on a knife's edge between diplomatic solutions and armed conflict. Dr. Morgan continued her quiet observation, occasionally making brief notes but never interrupting the flow of strategic planning. Marcus found himself stealing glances in her direction, puzzled by her calm demeanor in the face of discussions that could determine the fate of millions. Most civilian consultants he had encountered in these settings showed visible stress when confronted with the reality of military decision-making, but she appeared completely at ease. As the morning wore on, the conversation shifted to intelligence gaps that were hampering effective response planning. The room fell into a tense silence as Admiral Richardson outlined the challenges they faced in gathering real-time information from hostile territories. Traditional reconnaissance was being thwarted by advanced counter-surveillance technologies, and human intelligence networks were proving unreliable in the current political climate. The truth is, Richardson admitted with obvious frustration, we're operating with incomplete information at a time when precision is absolutely critical. One miscalculation could trigger a conflict none of us are prepared to manage. It was then that Dr. Morgan spoke for the first time that morning, her voice cutting through the tension with quiet authority. "The intelligence gaps you're describing aren't insurmountable. They require a different approach to information gathering and analysis. The room turned toward her with varying degrees of surprise and curiosity. She had been so quiet that some attendees had seemingly forgotten her presence entirely. Defense Secretary Williams raised an eyebrow. Dr. Morgan, do you have specific recommendations for addressing our intelligence challenges? She set down her pen and looked directly at Williams, her expression thoughtful but confident. I do, but my suggestions would require significant operational changes that might not align with current protocols. Marcus noticed something shift in the room's atmosphere. The dismissive glances that had occasionally drifted toward the quiet woman in the corner were replaced by focused attention. There was something in her tone that suggested expertise far beyond typical academic consultation. General Patricia Hayes, the highest-ranking woman in the room until Dr. Morgan's arrival, leaned forward with obvious interest. What kind of operational changes are we talking about? Dr. Morgan stood slowly, moving toward the large display screen that dominated one wall of the conference room. Her movement was deliberate and confident, lacking any of the hesitation typically shown by civilians in military settings. Current intelligence gathering is hampered by compartmentalization and outdated protocols that were designed for different types of conflicts, she began, her voice carrying easily through the room. Modern warfare requires integration of human intelligence, signals intelligence, and real-time satellite data in ways that our current structure simply doesn't accommodate. As she spoke, Marcus noticed the other officers beginning to lean forward, drawn in by the clarity and specificity of her analysis. This wasn't theoretical consultation, she was speaking from practical experience with operations that seemed far beyond the scope of typical Pentagon advisors. The Russian forces you're monitoring, she continued, are using communication protocols that suggest they're aware of our traditional surveillance methods. They're operating under the assumption that we're still using Cold War-era intelligence gathering, which creates opportunities if we're willing to adapt our approach. Admiral Richardson interrupted, his skepticism evident. Dr. Morgan, with respect, the intelligence community has been adapting to evolving threats for decades. What you're describing isn't exactly revolutionary thinking. She turned toward him with a slight smile that somehow managed to be both respectful and subtly challenging. You're absolutely right, Admiral. The intelligence community has been adapting. But military intelligence and operational intelligence aren't always perfectly aligned, particularly when rapid response is required. The room fell silent as the implications of her statements settled over the assembled officers. She was suggesting that traditional military command structure might be inadequate for the current crisis, a possibility that challenged everything they had been trained to believe about chain of command and operational authority. General Hayes broke the silence. Dr. Morgan, your analysis suggests you have extensive experience with intelligence operations. Can you tell us more about your background? For the first time since entering the room, Dr. Morgan hesitated. Marcus watched as she seemed to weigh her words carefully, as if deciding how much to reveal about herself. My experience has been primarily in strategic planning and operational oversight, she said finally. I've worked with various agencies and departments on matters of national security. It was a non-answer that somehow managed to be more intriguing than any detailed biography. The vagueness of her response, combined with the obvious depth of her knowledge, created an air of mystery that had everyone in the room reconsidering their initial assumptions about the quiet woman who had been sitting in their meetings for a week. Defense Secretary Williams studied her carefully. Dr. Morgan, your insights have been valuable, but I think we need to understand more clearly what authority you're operating under. Who exactly sent you to these briefings? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Marcus could feel the tension building as every person in the room waited for an answer that would either validate or demolish their growing respect for the mysterious consultant. Dr. Morgan returned to her seat with the same deliberate grace she had shown throughout the morning. She straightened her jacket and looked around the room, making eye contact with each officer before responding. My authority comes from the same place as yours, Secretary Williams. I serve at the pleasure of the President and at the direction of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The simple statement sent a ripple of confusion through the room. Civilian consultants didn't typically speak about presidential authority or Joint Chiefs directives with such casual familiarity. There was something in her tone that suggested she wasn't merely consulting for these organizations but was somehow integral to them. Colonel Thompson found himself studying Dr. Morgan with new intensity. Her comfort in military settings, her detailed knowledge of operational procedures, and her obvious familiarity with classified intelligence protocols were beginning to paint a picture that didn't match her modest civilian appearance. As the meeting continued, Dr. Morgan's contributions became increasingly central to the strategic planning process. She spoke knowledgeably about satellite positioning, naval deployment strategies, and communication security in ways that revealed intimate familiarity with military operations at the highest levels. Yet she maintained the same quiet, observational demeanor that had characterized her presence throughout the week. The morning's discussion was interrupted by an aide who entered with urgent communication from European Command. The situation on the Ukrainian border had escalated significantly, with Russian forces moving into positions that suggested imminent action. The room erupted in controlled chaos as officers began coordinating immediate response protocols. Through it all, Dr. Morgan remained seated, watching the organized activity with the calm attention of someone who had witnessed similar crises many times before. Her lack of visible stress or surprise in the face of potential international conflict was striking, particularly when contrasted with the urgent energy filling the rest of the room. As secure communications were established with field commanders and Allied forces, Marcus noticed that several officers began looking to Dr. Morgan for input on tactical decisions. It was subtle at first, quick glances seeking confirmation or guidance, but it gradually became more obvious that they were beginning to defer to her judgment despite her apparent civilian status. The transformation was remarkable. Within hours, the quiet woman who had been virtually invisible in morning meetings had become a central figure in crisis management planning. Her suggestions were being implemented without question, and her analysis was driving strategic decisions that would affect thousands of military personnel. Yet questions about her true identity and authority remained unanswered. Every inquiry about her background was met with careful deflection or vague references to classified oversight. It was becoming clear that Dr. Elizabeth Morgan was far more than she appeared to be, but the nature of her role remained frustratingly mysterious. As the day progressed and the crisis intensified, Marcus found himself wondering if they were all missing something fundamental about the woman who had quietly inserted herself into the most sensitive military planning sessions in the country. There was an authority in her demeanor that transcended rank or title, a confidence that suggested she was operating from a position of power that none of them fully understood. The afternoon brought news that would test every assumption they had made about chain of command, authority, and the true nature of military leadership in times of crisis. The afternoon crisis escalated beyond anyone's expectations when satellite intelligence revealed Russian mechanized divisions crossing into disputed territories, effectively forcing NATO's hand in what had been a carefully maintained diplomatic standoff. The Pentagon's Crisis Management Center transformed into a hub of controlled chaos, with secure communications linking Washington to military commanders across 3 continents. Dr. Morgan's transformation during this crisis was nothing short of remarkable. The quiet observer who had spent a week taking notes in the corner had become the de facto coordinator of military response planning, somehow managing to direct conversations and influence decisions without anyone questioning her authority to do so. It was as if she possessed an invisible command presence that others instinctively recognized and respected. Colonel Marcus Thompson watched this transformation with growing fascination and concern. In his 23 years of military service, he had never witnessed a civilian consultant wield such influence in operational planning, particularly during active crisis situations. Yet Dr. Morgan seemed to navigate the complex web of military hierarchy with an ease that suggested intimate familiarity with command structures and decision-making protocols. "We need real-time intelligence from reconnaissance assets in the region," she stated during one particularly intense planning session, her voice cutting through multiple competing conversations. "Current satellite coverage isn't providing the granular detail necessary for tactical deployment decisions." Admiral Richardson, who had initially shown skepticism toward her input, now nodded in agreement. "Agreed. We'll need to coordinate with intelligence agencies to redirect surveillance priorities." "Already in progress," Dr. Morgan replied, glancing at a secure tablet that had appeared at some point during the afternoon. "I've authorized enhanced surveillance packages for the next 72 hours. The casual mention of authorization sent another ripple of confusion through the room.
Civilian consultants typically recommended courses of action, they didn't authorize military operations.
Yet no one challenged her statement, perhaps because the crisis demanded action more than it demanded protocol adherence. General Patricia Hayes approached Dr. Morgan during a brief lull in communications with field commanders.
Elizabeth, I have to ask directly. What's your actual role in this operation?
The officers are starting to look to you for tactical guidance, and, while your insights have been invaluable, I need to understand the command structure we're operating under. Dr. Morgan looked up from her tablet, considering the question with the same careful deliberation she had shown throughout the week. Patricia, my role is whatever the situation requires it to be.
Right now, that means ensuring our response is coordinated and effective.
It was another non-answer that managed to be both completely honest and entirely evasive. General Hayes studied her colleague's face, searching for clues about the mystery that had been building since Dr. Morgan's first appearance in their meetings.
That's not really an answer, Elizabeth.
I've worked with Pentagon consultants for years, and none of them operate the way you've been operating today.
You're making decisions that typically require flag officer authorization.
Dr. Morgan smiled slightly, an expression that seemed to hold secrets the rest of the room couldn't begin to guess. Sometimes the most effective leadership is the kind that doesn't call attention to itself. Before General Hayes could pursue the matter further, Defense Secretary Williams called for attention as new intelligence arrived from European command. Russian forces had not only crossed into disputed territories but had also begun establishing forward operating bases, suggesting a planned occupation rather than a temporary incursion.
This changes everything, Williams announced grimly.
We're looking at potential long-term occupation, which means our response needs to be calibrated for extended operations rather than quick diplomatic resolution.
The room fell silent as the implications settled over the assembled officers.
Extended military operations would require resources, personnel, and political commitments that went far beyond the immediate crisis response they had been planning. Dr. Morgan stood and moved to the large situation display that dominated one wall of the command center. Her movement was fluid and confident, lacking any of the hesitation that might be expected from someone operating outside their normal authority structure. The Russian strategy appears to be based on the assumption that NATO response will follow predictable patterns, she began, her voice carrying easily through the now quiet room.
They're counting on our adherence to traditional escalation protocols to buy them time for territorial consolidation.
She gestured toward specific locations on the digital map, highlighting strategic positions that seemed to form a pattern invisible to the others until she pointed it out. However, if we adjust our deployment strategy to account for non-traditional response patterns, we can disrupt their timeline and force them into reactive rather than proactive positioning.
Admiral Richardson leaned forward, studying the tactical analysis she was presenting. Dr.
Morgan, what you're describing would require coordination between multiple Allied commands and real-time adjustment of deployment schedules that are typically planned months in advance.
Correct,
she replied without hesitation.
Which is why I've already initiated preliminary coordination with Allied command structures to ensure rapid response capability.
The statement sent another wave of confusion through the room. Initiating coordination with Allied commands was a responsibility that typically fell to senior military leadership or State Department officials.
Civilian consultants simply didn't have the authority or access required for such communications. Colonel Thompson found himself studying Dr. Morgan with renewed intensity.
Her casual mentions of authorizations and coordinations suggested access to communication channels and decision-making authorities that were far beyond anything a typical consultant would possess. Yet she continued to present herself simply as an advisor, despite evidence that she was operating with significant independent authority. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Chen, who had been monitoring communications with field units, looked up from her station with obvious confusion.
"Ma'am, I'm receiving confirmations on deployment adjustments that I didn't know had been authorized. European Command is acknowledging receipt of new operational parameters."
Dr. Morgan glanced at Chen's station with mild interest. The adjustments were necessary to maintain tactical flexibility in a rapidly evolving situation.
But who authorized them? Chen pressed, her confusion evident.
These are major operational changes that would typically require Defense Secretary approval and Joint Chiefs coordination. The room fell quiet as the question hung in the air. Every person present understood the implications of what Chen was describing. Unauthorized operational changes during an active crisis could result in court-martial proceedings, regardless of how well-intentioned or strategically sound they might be. Defense Secretary Williams stepped forward, his expression serious. "Dr. Morgan, I think we need to have a direct conversation about your authority and role in these operations. The questions being raised about authorization and coordination are legitimate concerns that affect operational security and chain of command integrity." For the first time since the crisis began, Dr. Morgan appeared to consider her response carefully. She looked around the room, taking in the faces of officers who had spent the day gradually deferring to her judgment despite not understanding the basis for her authority. "Secretary Williams, you're absolutely right. The situation has evolved beyond the point where ambiguity about roles and responsibilities is acceptable." She paused, seeming to weigh her words. "I think it's time for complete clarity about my position and authority." Marcus felt his pulse quicken as he realized they were about to receive answers to questions that had been building throughout the day. The mysterious Dr. Elizabeth Morgan was finally going to explain herself. She moved to the center of the room, her posture shifting in a way that seemed to command attention without any obvious change in her demeanor. It was as if she had decided to stop concealing something fundamental about herself. "For operational security reasons, I've been operating under civilian identification while observing and assessing our crisis response capabilities," she began. "However, current circumstances require full integration of command authority, which means concealment is no longer practical or necessary." The room waited in complete silence as she continued. "My actual role in military operations isn't as a consultant or advisor. I've been serving in this capacity for the past 18 months, with specific responsibility for evaluating and improving our rapid response protocols during international crises." General Hayes stepped forward, her expression intent. "Elizabeth, what exactly are you saying? What's your actual position?" Dr. Morgan straightened her shoulders and looked directly at Williams before scanning the faces of every officer in the room. When she spoke, her voice carried an authority that had been present but concealed throughout the day. "My operational authority comes from my position on the Joint Chiefs of Staff, where I serve as the principal advisor to the President and Secretary of Defense on strategic military planning and international crisis response." The statement hit the room like a physical force. Joint Chiefs of Staff positions were among the highest military appointments in the country, typically held by career officers with decades of service and public recognition within military communities. The idea that one of these positions could be held by someone operating under civilian cover was almost impossible to process. Admiral Richardson was the first to find his voice. "That's not possible. Joint Chiefs positions are public appointments. We know every member of the Joint Chiefs." Dr. Morgan's smile was patient but firm. "Admiral, you know the public faces of the Joint Chiefs. But not all positions within that structure are publicly acknowledged, particularly those dealing with sensitive intelligence operations and strategic planning that requires operational security." Colonel Thompson felt as if the ground was shifting beneath his feet. Everything he thought he knew about military command structure was being challenged by revelations that seemed impossible but were being presented with complete confidence by someone who had demonstrated intimate knowledge of the highest levels of military operations. "You're saying there are classified positions on the Joint Chiefs?" General Hayes asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm saying that effective national security sometimes requires structures that aren't publicly acknowledged," Dr. Morgan replied. "My position exists specifically to coordinate rapid response capabilities during international crises, with direct authority to authorize operational adjustments when time constraints don't allow for traditional consultation processes." The implications of her revelation were staggering. If she was telling the truth, then every authorization and coordination she had mentioned throughout the day had been legitimate exercises of actual military authority. The mysterious civilian consultant had actually been one of the highest-ranking military officials in the country, operating under deep cover to assess their crisis response capabilities. Defense Secretary Williams studied her with obvious calculation. Dr. Morgan, if what you're claiming is accurate, then you would have credentials and verification procedures that could confirm your position. She reached into her jacket and withdrew what appeared to be a standard Pentagon identification card. However, when she handed it to Williams, his expression changed dramatically as he examined it. This authorization level is. He paused, looking up at her with new understanding. This is genuine. The room erupted in controlled chaos as officers struggled to process the revelation that they had been working alongside one of the most senior military officials in the country without knowing it. The quiet woman who had seemed almost invisible just hours earlier was suddenly revealed as someone whose authority exceeded that of nearly everyone present. But, even as the shock of her revelation settled over the room, new questions were beginning to emerge. If Dr. Elizabeth Morgan was indeed a member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, operating undercover to assess their capabilities, what did that assessment reveal about their readiness for the crisis they were currently facing? The answers to those questions would prove even more shocking than her initial revelation. The revelation of Dr. Morgan's true identity sent shockwaves through the command center that extended far beyond the immediate crisis they were managing. As word spread through secure channels that a Joint Chiefs member had been operating undercover for over a week, evaluating their response protocols, a new kind of tension filled the room alongside the ongoing international emergency. Colonel Marcus Thompson found himself reviewing every interaction he had witnessed, every casual dismissal of the quiet woman in the corner, every moment when officers had spoken freely about operational concerns in her presence. The realization that their candid discussions of military readiness, resource limitations, and strategic weaknesses had been observed by someone with direct reporting authority to the President was both humbling and terrifying. "Ma'am," Admiral Richardson began, his entire demeanor transformed by the knowledge of her true rank, "I need to apologize for any inappropriate comments or behavior during your observation period." General Morgan, as she now asked to be addressed, waved away his concern with the same calm authority she had displayed throughout the crisis. "Admiral, the entire purpose of this assessment was to observe our actual operational capabilities, not our best behavior during formal inspections. Your candid discussions have been far more valuable than any prepared presentation could have been." The weight of her words settled over the room like a heavy blanket. They were being evaluated, and had been from the moment she first appeared in their meetings. Every decision, every reaction, every moment of confusion or coordination was being assessed by someone whose recommendations could reshape American military strategy. Defense Secretary Williams stepped forward, his expression serious. "General Morgan, I have to ask directly about the nature of this assessment. Are we looking at systematic problems in our crisis response capabilities?" For the first time since revealing her identity, General Morgan hesitated before responding. The pause was brief but meaningful, suggesting that her answer would carry implications none of them were prepared to hear. "Secretary Williams, the assessment has revealed both strengths and areas requiring immediate attention," she began carefully. "Our personnel are dedicated and capable, but our institutional structures may not be adequately adapted for the realities of modern international crises." Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Chen looked up from her communications station, where she had been coordinating with field units throughout the afternoon. "General, are you saying our response protocols are inadequate?" "I'm saying that the speed and complexity of modern conflicts require decision-making structures that can operate more efficiently than our current hierarchical systems allow," General Morgan replied. "Today's crisis has demonstrated both the potential and the limitations of our existing command structure." Colonel Thompson felt a chill as he began to understand the implications of her assessment. They weren't just being evaluated on their handling of the current crisis, they were being assessed on fundamental questions about how American military forces should be organized and commanded in an era where conflicts could escalate from diplomatic tensions to active warfare in a matter of hours. "What specific changes are being considered?" General Patricia Hayes asked, her voice tight with concern. General Morgan moved to the situation display, gesturing toward the real-time intelligence feeds that had been driving their tactical decisions throughout the day. "Consider what has happened during this crisis. Traditional consultation processes would have required hours or even days to authorize the operational adjustments we implemented in minutes. Our adversaries operate on timelines that our bureaucratic structures simply cannot match." She paused, allowing her words to sink in before continuing. However, when operational authority is properly positioned and utilized, our response capabilities are exceptional. The question is whether we're willing to adapt our institutional structures to optimize those capabilities. The room fell silent as officers began to grasp the magnitude of what she was describing. General Morgan wasn't just evaluating their performance, she was potentially recommending fundamental changes to military command structure that had been in place for decades.
Admiral Richardson cleared his throat.
General, with respect, the current command structure exists for important reasons. Chain of command integrity and civilian oversight are fundamental principles that protect both operational effectiveness and democratic governance.
You're absolutely correct, Admiral, General Morgan replied without hesitation. Those principles are non-negotiable.
But there's a difference between maintaining proper oversight and allowing bureaucratic inefficiency to compromise operational effectiveness.
The challenge is finding structures that preserve essential safeguards while enabling rapid response when circumstances demand it.
As she spoke, Marcus noticed that her demeanor had shifted subtly since revealing her true identity. The quiet, observational quality that had characterized her presence throughout the week had been replaced by the confident authority of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected global security. Yet she maintained the same respectful, collaborative tone that had made her contributions valuable even when her authority was unknown. The afternoon brought a new development that would test every theoretical discussion about command structure and operational efficiency. Intelligence reports indicated that the Russian incursion was expanding beyond initial projections, with additional mechanized units moving toward strategic positions that could threaten multiple NATO allies simultaneously. This is no longer a localized territorial dispute, Defense Secretary Williams announced grimly.
We're looking at the potential for multi-front engagement that could trigger Article 5 obligations across the alliance. The implications were staggering.
NATO's Article 5 collective defense provisions could transform a regional conflict into a global military engagement involving dozens of countries and millions of military personnel. The decisions made in the next few hours could determine whether the situation remained contained or escalated into the largest military conflict since World War II. General Morgan stepped forward as urgent communications began flooding in from Allied commands across Europe. With your permission, Secretary Williams, I recommend implementing enhanced coordination protocols that will allow real-time integration of Allied response capabilities. Williams studied her carefully.
What are you proposing, General?
Temporary authorization for direct coordination with Allied command structures, bypassing traditional consultation delays that could compromise our ability to respond effectively to rapid developments. The room tensed as officers realized she was proposing to streamline military decision-making in ways that would concentrate significant authority in fewer hands. It was exactly the kind of operational efficiency she had been discussing, but implemented during an active crisis with global implications. General, Admiral Richardson interjected, what you're describing would effectively create an expedited command structure that operates outside normal oversight protocols.
Not outside oversight, General Morgan corrected.
But, with oversight adapted to operational timelines rather than administrative convenience.
Every decision would be documented and reviewed, but authorization would occur concurrently with implementation rather than as a prerequisite to action.
Colonel Thompson found himself fascinated by the practical demonstration of the theoretical discussions they had been having about command structure adaptation. General Morgan wasn't just evaluating their current capabilities, she was proposing to implement alternative approaches in real time during an actual crisis. General Hayes voiced the concern that was undoubtedly on everyone's mind. General Morgan, implementing untested command structures during an active international crisis carries enormous risks.
If something goes wrong, the consequences could be catastrophic.
You're absolutely right, Patricia, General Morgan acknowledged.
But consider the alternative.
If our traditional structures prove inadequate for the speed and complexity of this crisis, the consequences could be equally catastrophic.
Sometimes the greatest risk is refusing to adapt when circumstances demand flexibility.
Defense Secretary Williams stood quietly for several moments, weighing the competing considerations of operational necessity against institutional stability. The decision he made would set precedents that could reshape American military command structure for years to come. "General Morgan," he said finally, "I'm authorizing implementation of your enhanced coordination protocols on a temporary basis, with full documentation and immediate review procedures. We'll adapt our response structure to match the demands of the situation while maintaining essential oversight safeguards." The authorization transformed the command center's operational tempo immediately. Secure communications channels that typically required multiple approval stages were activated within minutes. Intelligence sharing protocols that normally took hours to coordinate were implemented instantly. Real-time tactical coordination with Allied forces became possible in ways that had never been attempted during previous crises. Marcus watched in fascination as General Morgan orchestrated a seamless integration of capabilities that demonstrated the potential effectiveness of adaptive command structures. Orders were flowing more efficiently, intelligence was being shared more rapidly, and tactical adjustments were being implemented with a speed that would have been impossible under traditional protocols. Yet beneath the obvious operational improvements, he could sense the tension that came with operating outside established procedures. Every officer in the room understood that they were participating in a fundamental experiment in military command structure, with global implications hanging in the balance. Real-time intelligence indicates Russian forces have halted their advance, Lieutenant Colonel Chen reported after several hours of enhanced operations. Allied positioning appears to have convinced them that further territorial expansion would meet immediate and overwhelming resistance. A collective sigh of relief filled the room, but General Morgan remained focused on her coordination displays. The immediate crisis may be stabilizing, but the broader implications of this confrontation are just beginning to emerge. Our response demonstrated capabilities that will require permanent integration into our operational structure. Defense Secretary Williams approached her station. "General, I need your preliminary assessment of how these enhanced protocols performed under crisis conditions." She looked up from her displays, her expression serious but satisfied. "Secretary, the operational improvements were significant and measurable. Response times were reduced by approximately 60%, intelligence integration was seamless, and tactical coordination with allies reached levels we've never achieved previously." "And the risks," he pressed. "Manageable, provided proper safeguards are maintained. The key is ensuring that enhanced operational authority is balanced by enhanced accountability measures. Speed without oversight is dangerous, but oversight without speed can be equally problematic." As evening approached and the immediate crisis began to stabilize, the full magnitude of the day's events started to become clear. They had not only managed a potentially catastrophic international confrontation, but had also participated in a real-world test of revolutionary changes to American military command structure. General Morgan's assessment period was clearly complete, and her recommendations would soon be presented to the highest levels of government. The quiet woman who had spent a week observing their meetings had gathered evidence that could reshape how America responds to international crises for generations to come. But the most profound revelation was yet to come, one that would challenge everything they thought they knew about military leadership and the future of American national security. 3 days after the crisis had stabilized and Russian forces had withdrawn to their original positions, General Elizabeth Morgan requested a private meeting with the core team that had managed the emergency response. The Pentagon's executive conference room felt different somehow, charged with the weight of recent events and anticipation of revelations that could reshape their understanding of military leadership. Colonel Marcus Thompson arrived early, still processing the transformation he had witnessed over the past week. The quiet civilian consultant had not only revealed herself as one of the most senior military officials in the country but had also demonstrated command capabilities that challenged fundamental assumptions about military hierarchy and decision-making structures. As the other officers filed into the room, Marcus noticed that everyone's demeanor had changed since learning General Morgan's true identity. The casual interactions and informal discussions that had characterized previous meetings were replaced by the careful respect typically reserved for encounters with flag officers. Yet General Morgan herself seemed unchanged, maintaining the same approachable professionalism that had made her contributions valuable even when her authority was unknown. Defense Secretary Williams entered last, carrying a thick folder of documents that suggested the day's discussion would involve far more than a simple debrief of recent events. His expression was serious but not grim, indicating that General Morgan's assessment had yielded significant findings without revealing catastrophic problems. Ladies and gentlemen, Williams began as he took his seat. General Morgan has completed her comprehensive assessment of our crisis response capabilities. Today's briefing will cover her findings and recommendations, some of which will require significant policy considerations at the highest levels of government. General Morgan stood and moved to the presentation display, her movements carrying the same confident authority that had emerged once her true role was revealed. She had exchanged her civilian business attire for dress military uniform, and the stars on her shoulders seemed to legitimize the command presence she had demonstrated throughout the crisis. Over the past 18 months, I've conducted similar assessments at military commands throughout our global operations, she began. This evaluation was unique because it occurred during an actual international crisis, providing real-world data about our response capabilities under genuine operational pressure.
Admiral Richardson leaned forward, his curiosity evident. General, can you share how our performance compared to other commands you've assessed?
That comparison reveals both encouraging and concerning patterns, she replied, activating a series of charts that displayed response time metrics, coordination efficiency ratings, and decision-making effectiveness measures. Our personnel capabilities consistently exceed expectations, but our institutional structures create bottlenecks that compromise operational effectiveness.
The data was striking.
Response times varied dramatically depending on whether decisions followed traditional command hierarchy or utilized the streamlined protocols they had implemented during the crisis. Intelligence sharing efficiency showed similar patterns, with traditional channels creating delays that could prove critical during rapidly evolving situations. General Patricia Hayes studied the comparative data with obvious concern. General Morgan, these metrics suggest that our current command structure may be fundamentally inadequate for modern conflict scenarios. That's precisely the conclusion supported by data from multiple assessments, General Morgan confirmed. However, the solution isn't to abandon command structure integrity, but to evolve our institutional approaches to match the realities of contemporary warfare.
She advanced to a new series of displays showing theoretical command structures that could maintain essential oversight while enabling rapid response capabilities.
The models were complex but elegant, preserving democratic civilian control and accountability measures while streamlining operational decision-making processes. Colonel Thompson found himself both impressed and troubled by the implications of her presentation. The proposed changes would revolutionize American military command structure in ways that could improve effectiveness but might also concentrate power in concerning ways. General, he ventured, implementing these structural changes would require congressional approval and could face significant political resistance.
Are we looking at theoretical recommendations or practical implementation plans?
General Morgan's smile suggested she had been anticipating exactly that question. Colonel Thompson, the political challenges are significant but not insurmountable. The key is demonstrating that proposed changes enhance rather than compromise democratic oversight of military operations. Defense Secretary Williams opened his folder and withdrew a document bearing presidential seals and classified markings. General Morgan's assessment is part of a broader national security review that has been underway for the past 2 years.
Her findings will inform policy recommendations that will be presented to Congress within the next 60 days.
The revelation that General Morgan's assessment was connected to a presidential-level review of national security structures added new gravity to her findings. They weren't participating in theoretical discussions about military efficiency, they were contributing to actual policy development that could reshape American defense capabilities. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Chen, who had been studying the efficiency metrics displayed on the screens, looked up with obvious concern.
Ma'am, if these structural changes are implemented, how do we ensure that enhanced operational authority doesn't compromise the checks and balances that prevent military overreach?
It was the question that everyone had been thinking but hesitating to ask directly. The balance between operational effectiveness and democratic governance was one of the fundamental challenges of military organization in democratic societies. General Morgan nodded approvingly at the question.
Sarah, that concern is at the heart of every recommendation I'm making. Enhanced operational authority must be balanced by enhanced accountability measures.
Real-time decision-making capabilities need to be coupled with real-time oversight mechanisms. She activated a new display showing integrated command and oversight structures that demonstrated how rapid response capabilities could coexist with robust democratic controls. The system was sophisticated, utilizing technology and streamlined procedures to maintain oversight without sacrificing operational speed. The goal isn't to reduce oversight, she continued, but to make oversight as efficient and responsive as the operational capabilities we're trying to optimize. Democratic control of military forces is non-negotiable, but democratic control doesn't require bureaucratic inefficiency.
Admiral Richardson studied the proposed structures carefully.
General, implementing these changes would require retraining thousands of personnel and restructuring institutions that have been operating under current procedures for decades.
The transition period alone could create vulnerabilities that adversaries might exploit.
You're absolutely correct, Admiral, which is why implementation would be gradual and carefully managed, General Morgan replied. We would begin with pilot programs in selected commands, gather performance data, and expand successful approaches while modifying or discontinuing ineffective elements. The discussion that followed revealed the complexity of balancing military effectiveness with institutional stability and democratic governance. Every proposed improvement created new challenges that required careful consideration of unintended consequences and potential risks. As the morning progressed, it became clear that General Morgan's assessment extended beyond operational efficiency to fundamental questions about the role of military forces in American society. Her recommendations addressed not just how military decisions should be made, but who should make them and under what circumstances enhanced authority could be exercised.
Defense Secretary Williams consulted his documents before addressing the group.
General Morgan, your assessment includes recommendations about personnel selection and development that could significantly impact military career paths and promotion criteria. General Morgan's expression became serious as she transitioned to what was clearly the most sensitive aspect of her presentation. The personnel recommendations are based on observed disparities between traditional military career advancement and the skills required for effective leadership in contemporary operational environments. She activated displays showing career progression patterns, leadership competency assessments, and performance metrics that painted a complex picture of how military personnel development aligned with actual operational requirements. Traditional military advancement prioritizes experience and seniority, which provides valuable institutional knowledge and command maturity, she began. However, modern conflicts increasingly require technological sophistication, rapid adaptation capabilities, and integration skills that may not correlate directly with traditional career progression. The implications of her statement were profound. She was suggesting that the military's fundamental approach to identifying and developing leaders might be inadequate for contemporary challenges, requiring changes that could affect the careers and prospects of every officer in the room. General Hayes leaned back in her chair, processing the magnitude of what was being discussed.
General Morgan, are you recommending changes to promotion criteria and command selection processes?
I'm recommending comprehensive evaluation of how we identify and develop leadership potential, General Morgan replied carefully. The goal isn't to abandon the valuable aspects of traditional advancement, but to ensure that our leadership development processes produce officers capable of meeting the challenges they will actually face in their careers. Colonel Thompson felt the weight of personal implications as he considered how such changes might affect his own career trajectory and that of his colleagues. The possibility that fundamental military personnel policies could be restructured based on General Morgan's assessment was both exciting and terrifying.
General, he asked, what specific changes are being considered in leadership development and selection?
General Morgan's response would prove to be the most shocking revelation of her entire assessment, one that would challenge every assumption they held about military leadership and their own roles in the changing structure of American defense capabilities. The most significant recommendation involves creating integrated career tracks that combine traditional military experience with specialized technical education, diplomatic training, and private sector experience, she began. Future military leaders will need to operate effectively in environments that blur the boundaries between military, diplomatic, economic, and technological domains. She paused, scanning the faces of officers who were beginning to realize that their entire conception of military careers was about to be fundamentally challenged. However, the most important recommendation involves immediate implementation of enhanced leadership development programs for selected personnel who have demonstrated exceptional capabilities during crisis situations. Her gaze moved around the room, making eye contact with each officer present. Based on performance assessments conducted during the recent crisis, each of you has been selected for participation in an advanced leadership program that will prepare you for command responsibilities in the restructured organizational framework. The room fell silent as the implications of her statements settled over them. They weren't just witnesses to institutional change, they were being recruited as leaders in the transformation of American military command structure. General Morgan smiled as she delivered her final revelation. Your participation in this assessment wasn't coincidental. Each of you was selected based on identified leadership potential and demonstrated capabilities. This crisis provided an opportunity to observe your performance under actual operational pressure and confirm assessments that have been building over your entire careers. Marcus felt as if everything he thought he knew about his career, his role, and his future was being rewritten in real time. The quiet woman who had observed their meetings for a week hadn't just been evaluating their institutional capabilities, she had been evaluating them personally as potential leaders in a transformed military structure. The revelation that their entire careers had been shaped by assessments and selections they were unaware of was both humbling and inspiring. They were being offered opportunities to participate in changes that could define American military capability for generations, but accepting those opportunities would require embracing uncertainty and abandoning the familiar structures that had guided their professional lives. As General Morgan concluded her presentation and the meeting began to wind down, Marcus realized that the day marked not just the end of a crisis assessment, but the beginning of a transformation that would challenge everything they thought they knew about military leadership, institutional change, and their own roles in defending American interests in an increasingly complex world. The quiet woman in the corner had revealed not just her rank as a member of the Joint Chiefs, but her role as an architect of the future of American military power. The war room hadn't just frozen in shock at her revelation, it had become the launching point for changes that would reshape military service for every person who followed in their footsteps.